Hello, I'm Sensei Alex Kakio, and the title of today's talk is Reincarnation versus Rebirth, which is true. But before we get into that, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. That way you'll be notified when I post talks in the future. If you wouldn't mind hitting the like button, that'd be great too. And if you want to do a deep dive into Buddhist practice, check out my book, Perfectly Ordinary Buddhist Teachings for Everyday Life. There's a link to a sample chapter of the book in the description for this talk, and it's available for purchase on Amazon. Now, the first thing we have to understand before we get into today's talk is that Buddhism is a lot like other religious traditions, like Judaism or Christianity, in that there isn't one monolithic faith called Buddhism. Rather, it's separated into many different sects, traditions, and lineages, and all of them take a slightly different take on the teachings. As a result, there are some arguments that have literally been going on since the day after Buddha died. Are Buddhists allowed to eat meat? Are we already enlightened, or do we need to attain enlightenment? Do we need to meditate in order to attain enlightenment? These conversations have been going on and on for hundreds of years, and they'll probably keep going on for hundreds of years. One topic of very intense discussion, however, is the conversation of reincarnation versus rebirth, which are slightly different teachings on what happens after we die. And the reason that this is such a difficult conversation to have is that the Buddha gave different teachings depending on what sutra you read. So in the Vajrayana and the Theravada traditions, there are very clear teachings on reincarnation. However, in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, those sutras contain teachings that are more akin to rebirth. So I'll describe each of those to you, and then I'll go into which one is true. But before I get into that, I'll read a passage from Kyogo Shinsho, in which the Buddha describes his teaching method, and you'll figure out why I'm reading this passage here shortly. The Buddha is talking to his monks. He's describing his method for teaching the Dharma, and he says the following. The Tathagata, the world-honored one, explains one thing in two ways in response to the conditions of the place, to the times, to others' use of words, to the needs of the people, and to their various capacities. Namely, he uses innumerable names for one thing, he uses innumerable names that have one and the same meaning, and he uses innumerable names for innumerable meanings. What is using innumerable names for one thing? Nirvana may be presented as an example. It is called nirvana, also non-arising, non-emerging, non-action, unconditioned, taking refuge, cave shelter, liberation, light, torch, the other shore, fearlessness, non-retrogression, place of peace, full rest, tranquility, formlessness, non-duality, single practice, coolness, no darkness, non-hindrance, no dispute, non-defilement, vastness, nectar, and also auspiciousness. This is an example of using innumerable names for one thing. Now we'll come back to that passage from Kyogo Shinsho in a moment, but let's get into reincarnation versus rebirth. Now the teaching of reincarnation is fairly straightforward. We have a subtle mind essence, which is not a soul. It's not Atman, which is the Hindu teaching that we have a permanent eternal soul that goes from life to life. It's a little bit more nuanced. We have a subtle mind essence that is both us and not us at the same time, and that travels from one life to the next, one form to the next based on our karma. So we may be human in this life, and based on the next life, if we have negative karma, we may be reborn in the lower realms, say as an animal or a hungry ghost. Or if we have pretty decent karma, but it's not enough to attain enlightenment, we may be reborn in one of the heavenly realms. So that's reincarnation. Just think of it as you moving from one body to the next, over and over and over, until you attain enlightenment and end the cycle of retrotransgression. Now, rebirth is slightly different. And for rebirth, what happens is we can imagine an iceberg. Okay? So the iceberg is up in the North Pole. It's frozen ice, and it's in the ocean, but it's not the ocean, even though it's made of ocean water. And what I mean by that is that if we were a giant, let's say, we could take the iceberg, we could pick it up, the ocean's down here, the iceberg is here, they're separate, but they're made of the same stuff. So what happens is if the iceberg starts to float south, and the water warms, and it gets beat on by the sun, eventually it melts, returns to the ocean. The iceberg is gone, but the water that made it up is still there. And over time, the ocean currents carry some of that water back to the North Pole, and another iceberg is formed. Now, that iceberg is not the same iceberg that melted before, but it's not completely separate either, because it's made of the same ocean water that made up the first iceberg. So it is and is not the same iceberg at the same time. You can think of its pieces and parts having been recycled. So that's rebirth, and that's what's generally taught in Mahayana Buddhism. It goes along with the teaching of the storehouse consciousness, that we all arise from the storehouse, taking on different forms, and when we die, we return to that storehouse consciousness. So in this example, the iceberg is us, the ocean is the storehouse consciousness, and we come out of it, we go back into it, and then something that's like us but not actually us comes out of it again later on. Compare this to reincarnation, which again is generally taught in Vajrayana and Theravada traditions, and this is the subtle mind essence going from one life to the next. In Vajrayana tradition especially, this teaching is very important. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, he's said to be the 14th Dalai Lama because he is the 14th reincarnation of the same person who was originally born hundreds of years ago. So, which is true, reincarnation versus rebirth? And the answer is, they're both correct. The thing we have to remember about Buddhist teachings is they only make sense if we look at the entirety of the Buddhist canon. Reincarnation versus rebirth. To understand that, we have to imagine we're looking at a house. If I'm looking at the front of the house, I may say that a house has 2 windows, a front door, and hedges in front of it. Meanwhile, if you're on the side, you may say, no, there's no door, there's just 3 windows. And someone looking from the top may say you're both wrong. A house has no doors, no window. It only has a roof. All 3 are correct, but they're looking at the same thing from different sides. The Buddha, in the passage I read earlier, said that he often uses the capacity of his audience, the words they use, their culture, their language, to change the way he gives the teachings. It appears that they contradict each other, but really what he's doing is teaching the people based on their capacity. He's showing them the part of the house that they can most easily understand, whether it's the front door, or the front of the house, which is reincarnation, or the side of the house, which is rebirth. Now, the thing we have to understand, though, is the house we're talking about is infinitely large and infinitely wide. There's no way that anyone can see all the sides at once. So there's some humility that's required on our part to say, well, there's some things we just won't understand. And the reincarnation versus rebirth argument is one of those things. Instead of arguing over which is right and which is wrong, when, as I've established, Buddha taught both, and as he established, he gave different teachings based on who he was talking to and their capacity to learn, it's more skillful for us to take hold of the teaching that helps us lead a calmer, more peaceful life. In Buddhism, this is called upaya, or skillful means. And that's important because the 3 gates to enlightenment, according to Gyogo Shinsho, are wisdom, compassion, and expedient means. So what's the most expedient way for you to realize enlightenment, to realize nirvana, a calm, peaceful, tranquil self? Do you like reincarnation? Do you like rebirth? Let me know in the comments. So that's the talk for today. I hope it was helpful. If you'd like to read articles I've written on Buddhist practice, you can do that at my blog, The Same Old Zen. Link for that is in the description for this talk. And again, I'd love to hear from you guys. Which teaching, reincarnation or rebirth, do you subscribe to? Or do you subscribe to a completely different teaching about the afterlife? I promise I'll respond, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. So, until next time, Amitabha.